Siblings clash over family farm inheritance. Father's video will reveals an unexpected condition. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. The day had finally come. Two siblings, once inseparable, now stood on opposite sides of an invisible divide, both too proud to admit the pain that had torn them apart. The quiet halls of the family farmhouse, once filled with laughter, now echoed with the heavy silence of unresolved grief. As they gathered to hear their father's final words, neither could have predicted the bombshell that was about to drop. A revelation so profound that it would force them to confront the darkest corners of their past and challenge everything they believed about love, family, and forgiveness. But this wasn't just a story about inheritance or a fight over land. This was about the heavy weight of guilt, the silent burden of secrets, and the unspoken words that had festered for years. The truth, long buried and almost forgotten, was about to rise to the surface, leaving no one unscathed. What happens when the very thing you've been running from your whole life is the only thing that can set you free? Get ready for a journey that will take you to the deepest depths of the human heart, where the lines between right and wrong blur, and where the only way out is through the kind of pain that leaves you forever changed. This is not just a story. It's an emotional reckoning that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last second. The cool autumn breeze carried the scent of freshly turned earth as the Carter family gathered at Oakwood Cemetery. The usually tranquil grounds were disrupted by the somber procession, with black-clad figures moving silently toward a newly dug grave. At the center of it all lay a polished mahogany casket, holding the mortal remains of William Carter, a man whose very name had become synonymous with hard work and success in Millbrook, Virginia. As the pastor's words drifted over the assembled mourners, two figures stood apart from the rest, their body language a stark contrast to the united front presented by the other attendees. On one side stood Ethan Carter, his jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the casket, as if willing it to disappear. At 35, he was the spitting image of his father, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same steely gaze that had intimidated business rivals and misbehaving farmhands alike. Across from him, separated by an invisible chasm of pain and resentment, stood Grace Carter. At 32, she was a study in fragility, her slender frame seeming to sway with each gust of wind. Her eyes, red-rimmed and puffy, darted between the casket and her brother, a maelstrom of grief and guilt evident in their depths. As the pastor's voice faded, replaced by the mournful notes of Amazing Grace, played on a lone bagpipe, memories assaulted both siblings with the force of a summer storm. Ethan found himself thrust back to a warm July evening 5 years ago. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, and his mother's scream echoing in his ears. He had arrived at the scene to find Grace, hysterical and bleeding, being pulled from the driver's seat. Their mother, Margaret, lay motionless in the passenger side, her life already slipping away. The accusation had torn from his throat before he could stop it. "What did you do?" Grace, for her part, was lost in the fog of that same night. The deer that had appeared out of nowhere, her desperate attempt to swerve, the terrifying moment when the car wouldn't respond. Then darkness, followed by Ethan's face, contorted with rage and grief. His words had cut deeper than any of her physical injuries. "You killed her. You killed Mom." The bagpipe's final note hung in the air, snapping both siblings back to the present. As the casket began its descent into the earth, a suited man with a briefcase stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Mr. and Ms. Carter," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I apologize for the interruption, but your father left explicit instructions. The reading of the will is to take place immediately following the service, at the family home." A ripple of surprise passed through the gathered mourners. William Carter had always been a man who did things his own way, but this seemed unusually brusque even for him. Ethan's eyes narrowed, while Grace wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. Within the hour, a small group had assembled in the study of the Carter family home, a sprawling farmhouse that had stood for generations. Family portraits lined the walls, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Ethan paced by the fireplace, while Grace perched on the edge of a leather armchair, looking as if she might bolt at any moment. The lawyer, Mr. Jennings, placed his briefcase on the massive oak desk and extracted a single envelope and a USB drive. "Mr. Carter left a video message," he explained, inserting the drive into a laptop. "He was most insistent that it be played for you both together." The screen flickered to life, revealing William Carter propped up in a hospital bed, his once imposing frame now frail and gaunt. Despite his obvious weakness, his eyes blazed with the same intensity that had driven him to build an agricultural empire from a single plot of land. "Ethan, Grace," he began, his voice raspy but firm. "If you're watching this, then I've finally lost the one fight I couldn't win." He paused, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I've never been one for flowery speeches or long goodbyes, so I'll get right to it. The farm, everything I've built, it's yours. But there's a condition." Ethan tensed, while Grace leaned forward, her eyes wide. William's face grew serious, his gaze seeming to pierce through the screen. "You two were the light of your mother's life and mine. Seeing you torn apart these past 5 years, it's been harder than any illness." He took a shuddering breath. "So here's my last request, my final lesson if you will. You'll inherit everything, but only if you can forgive. Truly forgive each other and yourselves." The siblings stared at the screen in shock as William continued. "You have 1 year from today. Live on the farm together. Work it together. Remember what it means to be family. If you can do that, if you can heal this rift, then the legacy your mother and I built will be yours to carry forward." Tears welled in William's eyes, a sight neither of his children could ever recall seeing before. "Please," he implored, his voice breaking, "find your way back to each other. It's what your mother would have wanted. It's what I need to know is possible, even if I won't be here to see it." The screen went dark, leaving the room in stunned silence. Ethan's hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. Grace had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mr. Jennings cleared his throat softly. "There are, of course, more details to discuss, but perhaps we should reconvene tomorrow." He looked between the siblings, concern etched on his face. Ethan nodded curtly, already striding toward the door. Grace remained frozen in her seat, overwhelmed by the enormity of what lay before them. As the door closed behind the lawyer, the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, marking the beginning of a year that would either heal their family or tear it apart for good. The challenge their father had laid before them hung in the air, as daunting as the vast fields that stretched beyond the windows, fields that had once represented their shared heritage, but now stood as a battleground for redemption, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. The early morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Carter farm, shrouding the landscape in ethereal haze. Inside the sprawling farmhouse, an uneasy silence reigned, broken only by the occasional creak of old floorboards and the muffled sounds of movement from separate rooms. Ethan Carter stood at the kitchen window, a steaming mug of black coffee clutched in his hand. His gaze swept over the fields that had been his playground, his classroom, and ultimately his legacy. Now, those same fields felt like a prison sentence. He took a long swig of coffee, wincing as the scalding liquid burned his throat. Upstairs, Grace sat on the edge of her childhood bed, fingers tracing the familiar patterns of the patchwork quilt her mother had made. Memories flooded back of laughter-filled summer evenings, of whispered secrets, of a family whole and unbroken. A family that now existed only in faded photographs and painful remembrances. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7, both siblings steeled themselves for the inevitable confrontation. They met on the landing, a fleeting moment of eye contact quickly broken as they descended the stairs in uncomfortable tandem. In the kitchen, Ethan busied himself with the coffee maker, his movements sharp and agitated. Grace hesitated in the doorway before moving to the refrigerator, the simple act of gathering breakfast ingredients feeling surreal in its normalcy. "I'll be heading out to check the south pasture fences," Ethan said abruptly, breaking the silence. "Storm last week might have taken some down." Grace nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. "I was thinking of going through Dad's office," she offered tentatively. "There might be paperwork we need to." Her voice trailed off as Ethan's jaw tightened visibly. William's office had been his sanctuary, a place where he'd built his agricultural empire and made decisions that affected not just their family, but the entire community. "Fine," Ethan grunted, downing the last of his coffee. "Just don't move anything around. We don't know what's important yet." As he strode out of the kitchen, Grace called after him, her voice small but determined. "Ethan, we need to talk about this. About what Dad asked us to do." Ethan paused at the door, his hand on the knob. For a moment, it seemed he might turn back, might bridge the chasm between them. But then his shoulders stiffened, and without a word, he was gone. Left alone in the suddenly vast kitchen, Grace sank into a chair, her appetite evaporating. How could they possibly fulfill their father's last wish when they could barely stand to be in the same room? As the morning wore on, Grace found herself in William's office, surrounded by the artifacts of a life well lived. Photographs lined the walls, William and Margaret on their wedding day, a young Ethan proudly holding up his first caught fish, Grace beaming at her high school graduation. Family milestones frozen in time, a stark contrast to the fractured reality they now inhabited. With a heavy sigh, Grace began sorting through the papers on the massive oak desk. Amidst the contracts and financial statements, a small leather-bound book caught her eye. Her breath caught as she recognized her mother's handwriting on the first page. Margaret's diary. Her hands trembling slightly, Grace opened the journal, feeling both like an intruder and a child desperately seeking comfort. As she read, tears began to blur her vision. "Oh, Gracie," one entry read, dated just weeks before the accident. "You remind me so much of myself at your age. So full of dreams, so eager to make your mark on the world. I worry sometimes that same passion that drives you can also blind you to the risks. Please, my darling girl, always remember to look before you leap." A sob escaped Grace's throat, echoing in the quiet room. Had her mother sensed something? Had she known, somehow, that tragedy was lurking just around the corner? Miles away, Ethan worked methodically, mending fences with practiced ease. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the turmoil in his mind. With each post he drove into the ground, he tried to bury the anger, the grief, the gnawing guilt that had been his constant companions for 5 long years. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, memories he'd long suppressed began to surface. He saw Grace as a toddler, taking her first wobbly steps across this very pasture. His own small hand held out to catch her if she fell. He remembered teaching her to drive the old pickup truck, her laughter ringing out as she finally managed to shift gears without grinding them. When had that laughter died? When had the easy companionship of siblings turned to this aching void of resentment and unspoken accusations? Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his wife. "Lisa, how's it going? Do you need me to come out there?" He stared at the screen, conflicted. Lisa had been his rock these past years, a calm presence in the storm of his grief. But this was something he and Grace had to face alone. "I'm fine," he typed back, knowing it for the lie it was. "Just a lot to process. I'll call you tonight." As Ethan tucked the phone away, his gaze fell on the farmhouse in the distance. He could just make out a figure, Grace, standing at the window of their father's office. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember the sister he'd once adored, the confidant who'd known his every secret, the person he'd trusted most in the world. Then the memory of screeching tires and shattering glass intruded, and Ethan turned away. His jaw clenched against the wave of pain and anger that threatened to overwhelm him. Back in the office, Grace clutched her mother's diary to her chest, her mind reeling from what she'd discovered within its pages. There were secrets here, not just her mother's gentle worries, but hints of something deeper, something that could change everything they thought they knew about that fateful night. As the day wore on, both siblings found themselves grappling not just with the ghosts of the past, but with the daunting task that lay ahead. How could they possibly bridge this gulf between them? How could they honor their father's last wish when every interaction was laden with unspoken accusations and barely contained grief? The sun began to set, painting the Virginia sky in hues of orange and pink. In the growing twilight, Ethan and Grace moved about the farmhouse like wary strangers, the weight of their shared history and uncertain future hanging heavy in the air. As night fell, they retreated to their separate rooms, each lying awake, haunted by memories and unanswered questions. The old farmhouse creaked and settled around them, as if sighing at the pain contained within its walls. In the darkness, Grace's fingers traced the edges of her mother's diary, while Ethan stared at the ceiling, the echo of his father's final plea playing on repeat in his mind. Find your way back to each other. The challenge their father had set before them loomed large, a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. But as sleep finally claimed them, a tiny spark of hope flickered in each of their hearts, a fragile, tentative thing, but present nonetheless. For in the depths of their pain, a truth remained unspoken. Beneath the layers of hurt and resentment, they were still brother and sister. And perhaps, just perhaps, that bond might be strong enough to weather the storm that lay ahead. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the Virginia autumn painting the landscape in vibrant hues of red and gold. Inside the Carter farmhouse, the atmosphere remained tense, the air thick with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. Ethan, ever the early riser, was already on his second cup of coffee when Grace ventured into the kitchen. She hesitated in the doorway, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sweater. "Morning," Ethan grunted, not looking up from the farm ledger spread out before him. Grace took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Ethan, I think we need to talk about Dad's request." Ethan's pen paused mid-stroke. For a long moment, he said nothing, the only sound in the room the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, he sighed, closing the ledger. "What's there to talk about?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Dad made his wishes clear. We've got a year to figure this out." The words seemed to pain him, as if the very idea of reconciliation was a physical burden. Grace moved further into the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Maybe we could start by spending some time together? Like we used to." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "Fine. I need to check the apple orchard today. You can come along if you want." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Grace felt a tiny flicker of hope in her chest as she followed Ethan out to the old pickup truck. The drive to the orchard was silent, the only sounds the rumble of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. As they passed familiar landmarks, memories flooded back unbidden. The old oak tree where they'd built a treehouse as kids, the pond where they'd spent countless summer days fishing and swimming. Each sight a bittersweet reminder of what they'd lost. At the orchard, they fell into an uneasy rhythm, moving between the rows of trees, checking for disease and pests. The work was monotonous, but it allowed for moments of quiet reflection. "Remember when we used to sneak out here and eat apples until we got sick?" Grace ventured, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Ethan paused, a fleeting look of nostalgia crossing his face. "Yeah, Mom would always know, no matter how well we thought we'd hidden the evidence." For a brief moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by a shared fondness for the memory. But then, as if remembering himself, Ethan's expression hardened once more. As the day wore on, their attempts at conversation grew more strained. Every topic seemed to lead back to the accident, to the years of silence and hurt that lay between them. By mid-afternoon, they were working in complete silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. It was Grace who finally broke, unable to bear the oppressive quiet any longer. "Ethan, please, we can't go on like this. We have to talk about what happened." Ethan whirled to face her, his eyes flashing with a mix of pain and anger. "Talk about what, Grace? About how you were driving too fast that night? About how you took Mom away from us?" The words hit Grace like a physical blow. "It was an accident, Ethan. Do you think I don't replay that night in my head every single day? Do you think I don't wish it had been me instead of her?" Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, years of pent-up guilt and grief pouring out. Ethan stood frozen, his own emotions warring across his features. "I lost her too, Ethan," Grace continued, her voice breaking. "And then I lost you, my brother, my best friend. Do you have any idea how that felt?" For a moment, it seemed Ethan might break, might finally let down the walls he'd built around his heart. But then his expression closed off once more. "We should head back," he said, his voice flat. "There's still work to do at the house." The ride home was silent, the brief moment of connection lost. As they pulled up to the farmhouse, Ethan spoke without looking at Grace. "I'll be in the barn if you need me. There are some repairs I've been putting off." Grace watched him stride away, her heart heavy. This wasn't going to be easy. Perhaps it wasn't even possible. How could they bridge a gap that seemed to widen with every word spoken? With a sigh, she turned toward the house, only to pause as something caught her eye. The attic window was open, curtains billowing in the breeze. Strange. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had been up there. Curiosity piqued. Grace made her way up to the attic. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight as she pushed open the creaky door. The space was cluttered with the detritus of generations, old furniture, boxes of yellowed papers, forgotten knickknacks. As she moved further into the room, her foot caught on something, sending her stumbling. Steadying herself against an old dresser, Grace noticed a small wooden box that had fallen open, its contents spilling onto the floor. Kneeling to gather the scattered items, she froze as she recognized her father's handwriting on a bundle of old letters. With trembling hands, she unfolded the topmost letter, her eyes widening as she read. "My dearest Amelia," it began. "I know it's been years since we last spoke, but I find myself thinking of you more and more these days." Grace sank to the floor, her mind reeling. Who was Amelia? And why had her father been writing such intimate letters to her? As she read on, a picture began to emerge. One of a relationship that predated William's marriage to Margaret, of a love that had never quite faded. The final letter, dated just a few months before William's death, hinted at a secret that had been kept for decades. Grace's head spun. This changed everything? Or did it? What did this mean for their family, for the legacy their father had left them? Lost in thought, she didn't hear the attic door open, didn't realize Ethan had entered until his shadow fell across her. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice wary. Grace looked up at her brother, the letters clutched to her chest. In that moment, she made a decision that would alter the course of their relationship forever. "Ethan," she said softly, "I think there's something you need to see." As she held out the letters, the air between them seemed to crackle with potential energy. They stood on the precipice of a revelation that could either heal their broken bond or shatter it beyond all hope of repair. In the fading light of the attic, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared past, brother and sister faced each other, and the truth that lay waiting to be uncovered. The attic air grew thick with tension as Ethan's eyes darted between Grace's face and the letters in her outstretched hand. Suspicion warred with curiosity in his expression. "What are those?" he asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Grace took a deep breath. "They're letters. From Dad. To someone named Amelia." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Amelia? I don't remember any Amelia." "Neither do I," Grace admitted. "But Ethan, these letters, they're not just friendly correspondence. They're intimate." A flash of anger crossed Ethan's face. "What are you saying? That Dad was cheating on Mom?" "No. I don't think so. The earliest ones are from before he met Mom. But the last one..." Grace hesitated, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "It's dated just a few months ago." Ethan snatched the letters from Grace's hand, his eyes scanning the pages rapidly. As he read, the color drained from his face. "This can't be real," he muttered. "Dad would never." But even as he spoke, memories began to surface. Hushed phone conversations that would end abruptly when someone entered the room. Occasional trips their father would take alone, always explaining them away as business meetings or agricultural conferences. Grace watched the realization dawn on her brother's face. "Ethan," she said gently, "I think there's more to this. Look at the last letter." With shaking hands, Ethan unfolded the final page. As he read, his eyes widened. "He mentions a safety deposit box," he said, his voice barely audible. "Says there's something there that will explain everything." The siblings' eyes met, a spark of their old connection flickering to life in the face of this shared discovery. "We have to find that box," Grace said, determination coloring her tone. Ethan nodded, his earlier hostility momentarily forgotten in light of this new mystery. "First thing tomorrow, we'll go to the bank." As they made their way downstairs, the atmosphere between them had shifted. The anger and resentment were still there, simmering beneath the surface. But now there was something else too, a shared purpose, a mutual need for answers. That night, sleep eluded both of them. Grace tossed and turned, her mind racing with possibilities. Who was Amelia? What secret had their father been keeping all these years? And how would this revelation affect the delicate balance of their already fractured family? Across the hall, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a tumultuous whirlwind. He found himself thinking of his mother, her warm smile, her unwavering love for their family. Had she known about Amelia? Had their entire childhood been built on a foundation of lies? As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the farmhouse, Ethan and Grace met in the kitchen. No words were exchanged as they gulped down coffee and headed for Ethan's truck. The drive to the bank in town was tense, filled with unasked questions and unvoiced fears. At Millbrook First National, they were greeted by Mrs. Henderson, a kindly older woman who had known their family for years. Her smile faltered as she took in their serious expressions. "We need to access our father's safety deposit box," Ethan said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, I'll just need to see some identification." As they followed her to the vault, Grace felt her heart pounding. Whatever was in that box, she knew instinctively that it would change everything. The box itself was small and unassuming. As Mrs. Henderson left them alone in the private viewing room, Ethan and Grace exchanged a look. This was it, the moment of truth. With trembling hands, Ethan opened the box. Inside lay a single envelope and a small, velvet-covered box. The envelope was addressed simply, "For my children." Grace reached for it, but Ethan caught her wrist. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse. Maybe we shouldn't do this. What if it's better not knowing?" For a moment, Grace was tempted to agree. But then she thought of the past 5 years, the pain, the silence, the wall that had grown between them. "We need to know, Ethan," she said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Taking a deep breath, he opened the envelope and began to read aloud. "My dear Ethan and Grace, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered the letters to Amelia. I owe you both an explanation, one I should have given years ago. Amelia was my first love, long before I met your mother. We were young and foolish, and when her family moved away, we lost touch. I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever. Then, 30 years later, Amelia reached out to me. She was dying, and she had a secret she needed to share. A secret that would change everything. Grace, Ethan, Amelia had a daughter. Our daughter, your half-sister." Ethan's voice broke, unable to continue. Grace took the letter from his shaking hands. Her own vision blurred with tears as she read on. "I didn't know about her until Amelia contacted me. By then, she was grown with a family of her own. I was shocked, overwhelmed, and ashamed. I couldn't bring myself to tell you or your mother. It felt like a betrayal of the life we'd built together. But now, as I face my own mortality, I realize that keeping this secret has been the real betrayal. You deserve to know the truth about your family. In the box with this letter, you'll find a locket. It contains a picture of your sister, Sarah, and her contact information. Whether you choose to reach out to her is up to you. But please know that my love for you both, and for your mother, was never diminished by this revelation. If anything, it made me cherish our family all the more. I hope that in time you can forgive me for my silence. And more than anything, I hope this truth brings you closer together, rather than pushing you further apart. With all my love, Dad. As Grace's voice faded, a heavy silence fell over the room. Ethan sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Grace felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. Everything she thought she knew about her family suddenly cast in a new light. With trembling fingers, she opened the velvet box. Inside lay a delicate gold locket. As she clicked it open, she found herself staring at a face that was both familiar and strange. A woman with their father's eyes and their mother's smile. "Ethan," she whispered, holding out the locket. "Look." As Ethan raised his head, his tear-streaked face a mirror of Grace's own emotions. Their eyes met. In that moment, something shifted between them. The anger, the blame, the years of hurt. It all seemed to pale in comparison to this new reality. They were no longer just two siblings struggling with the weight of the past. They were part of a larger story, one that challenged everything they thought they knew about their family, about their father, about themselves. As they sat there, surrounded by the echoes of their father's final confession, Ethan reached out and took Grace's hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Whatever lay ahead, whatever revelations or challenges they might face, they would face them together. The truth had come to light, bringing with it pain and uncertainty. But as Grace squeezed her brother's hand, she felt something else too, a glimmer of hope, fragile but undeniable, that perhaps this shared shock could be the catalyst for healing the rift between them. Outside the bank, life in Millbrook continued as always, unaware of the seismic shift occurring within the walls of the safety deposit room. For Ethan and Grace Carter, however, nothing would ever be the same again. The Virginia sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the Carter farm as Ethan's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway. The siblings sat in silence, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily upon them. The locket lay between them on the seat, a tangible reminder of the secret that had upended their world. As they entered the farmhouse, the familiar creaks of the old floorboards seemed to echo the turmoil in their hearts. Grace moved towards the kitchen, her movements automatic as she filled the kettle for tea, a habit inherited from their mother during times of stress. Ethan slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair. "I can't believe it," he muttered, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving the bank. "All these years, Dad had another daughter. We have a sister." Grace set two steaming mugs on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "I know, it's overwhelming." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Ethan, do you think, should we try to contact her? Sarah?" Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a mix of emotions. Anger, fear, confusion. "Contact her? Grace, we don't even know this woman. She's a stranger." "But she's family," Grace countered, her voice soft but insistent. "Dad wanted us to know about her. Maybe this is why he left us the farm together. Maybe he hoped we'd all connect somehow." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. You're talking about reaching out to some secret sister when we can't even—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between them. Grace felt a flicker of the old pain, the chasm that had separated them for so long. Can't even what, Ethan? Talk to each other? Be in the same room without it feeling like a battleground? The tension in the room was palpable, years of unresolved grief and anger bubbling to the surface. Ethan paced the kitchen, his movements agitated. "You want to talk? Fine, let's talk. Let's talk about how you were driving too fast that night. How if you'd just been more careful, Mom would still be here." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Grace felt as if she'd been slapped, tears welling in her eyes. "Is that what you really think? After all this time, you still blame me?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Ethan exploded. "Everything I thought I knew about our family seems to be a lie. Dad's secret daughter, Mom's accident. What else don't I know, Grace? Grace stood, her own anger rising to meet Ethan's. You want to know something? I've spent every day of the last 5 years wishing it had been me instead of Mom. Every single day. Do you have any idea what that's like? Ethan's face contorted with a mix of pain and fury. Don't you dare act like you're the only one who's suffered. You're not the one who had to identify Mom's body. You're not the one who had to plan her funeral while you were recovering in the hospital. No, I just lost my mother and my brother in one night, Grace shouted back, tears streaming down her face. Because that's what it felt like, Ethan. You shut me out completely. When I needed you most, you weren't there. The siblings stood facing each other, both breathing heavily, years of pent-up emotions finally breaking free. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gentle ticking of the kitchen clock, a sound that suddenly reminded Grace of something. Without a word, she turned and rushed out of the kitchen, leaving a bewildered Ethan in her wake. She returned moments later, clutching a familiar object, the old car keys to their mother's vehicle. What are you doing? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from shouting. Grace's eyes were alight with a mix of determination and desperation. I'm going to prove to you once and for all that it wasn't my fault. The car, there was something wrong with it. I've always known, but I could never prove it. Before Ethan could respond, Grace was out the door, marching purposefully towards the old barn where their mother's car had been stored since the accident. Ethan followed, a mix of confusion and curiosity overriding his anger. The barn door creaked open, revealing the dust-covered shape of their mother's car, untouched for 5 years. Grace approached it with reverence, her hand shaking as she inserted the key into the door. Grace, what are you doing? Ethan asked, his voice softer now, tinged with concern. Just watch, Grace replied, sliding into the driver's seat. She took a deep breath, then turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, the sound eerily loud in the quiet barn. Grace's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Ethan, I need you to stand in front of the car. What? No way, Ethan protested. Please, Grace pleaded, her eyes meeting his. Trust me, just this once. Something in her gaze must have convinced him, because Ethan slowly moved to stand a few feet in front of the car. Grace nodded, then pressed down on the brake pedal. Nothing happened. She pressed harder. Still, the car didn't move. Ethan's eyes widened as realization dawned. The brakes! Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. They failed that night. I tried to tell you to tell everyone, but no one would listen. And then it was just easier to believe it was my fault. Because if it wasn't, then it was just a senseless accident. And somehow that felt even worse. She stepped out of the car, her legs shaky. Ethan stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. All this time, he whispered, all this time, I blamed you, and the magnitude of the moment washed over them both. 5 years of misplaced blame, of broken trust, of a family torn apart by grief and misunderstanding. All of it crystallized in this single revelation. Ethan moved first, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He wrapped his arms around Grace, pulling her into a fierce embrace. I'm sorry, he choked out, his voice breaking. God, Grace, I'm so sorry. Grace clung to her brother, sobs racking her body as years of pent-up guilt and pain poured out. They stood like that for what felt like hours. The truth of the past finally laid bare between them. As they pulled apart, both red-eyed and emotionally drained, Ethan spoke softly. What do we do now? Grace took a shaky breath, her hand finding Ethan's and squeezing it tightly. We start over, she said. We honor Mom's memory and Dad's last wish. And maybe we try to find our sister. Ethan nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through his tears. Together, Grace affirmed, as they walked out of the barn, arm in arm. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The old farmhouse stood before them, no longer a symbol of their broken family, but a promise of new beginnings. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still wounds to heal, truths to face, and a new family member to potentially meet. But for the first time in 5 long years, Ethan and Grace Carter faced the future not as adversaries, but as the brother and sister they were always meant to be. The truth had indeed come to light, bringing with it pain and revelation in equal measure. But in that pain, in that long overdue honesty, the seeds of reconciliation had finally taken root. The following week passed in a blur of emotional conversations and tentative steps toward reconciliation. Ethan and Grace found themselves rediscovering the easy companionship they'd once shared, though the specter of their past still lingered in quiet moments. On a crisp Saturday morning, they sat at the kitchen table, the locket containing Sarah's photo and contact information between them. They had decided it was time to reach out to their newfound sister, but the prospect was daunting. What if she doesn't want anything to do with us? Grace voiced the fear that had been gnawing at both of them. Ethan reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Then we'll deal with it together. But we have to try, right? As Grace nodded, the sound of tires on gravel drew their attention. Through the window, they saw a familiar car pulling up. Lisa, Ethan's wife. I forgot she was coming by today, Ethan said, rising to greet her. Lisa entered the kitchen, her smile faltering as she took in the serious expressions on the siblings' faces. Is everything okay? She asked, her gaze moving between them. Ethan and Grace exchanged a look. They hadn't told anyone about their discovery yet, but if there was anyone they could trust, it was Lisa. She had been a constant support for Ethan through the years of estrangement, and had always encouraged reconciliation between the siblings. Sit down, honey, Ethan said softly. There's something we need to tell you. Over the next hour, they recounted the events of the past week. Finding the letters, the revelation at the bank, and the truth about the car accident. Lisa listened with wide eyes, her hand covering her mouth in shock as the story unfolded. Oh my God, she whispered when they finished. I can't believe it. A secret sister, and the accident. She turned to Grace, tears in her eyes. All this time, you've been carrying that burden alone. Grace nodded, her own eyes welling up. It's been hard. But now, knowing the truth, it feels like maybe we can finally start to heal. Lisa reached out, taking both Ethan and Grace's hands in hers. I'm so proud of you both, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For facing this together, for being willing to open your hearts to this new family member. A comfortable silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. It was Lisa who finally spoke again, her voice hesitant. There's something I need to tell you both as well, she said, her gaze fixed on the table. Something I've been keeping to myself, but in light of all this honesty, I think it's time. Ethan and Grace exchanged a worried glance. What is it, honey? Ethan asked, concern evident in his voice. Lisa took a deep breath, then reached into her purse, pulling out a small, worn notebook. It's about your mother, she said softly. The siblings froze, their eyes locked on the notebook. Mom's diary, Grace whispered, recognizing it instantly. Lisa nodded. She gave it to me just a few days before the accident. She made me promise not to tell anyone unless something happened to her. With trembling hands, she opened the diary to a marked page and began to read. I've suspected for a while now, but today I confirmed it. The brakes on the car are failing. William insists it's fine, that I'm just being paranoid, but I know something's wrong. I've tried to tell him, but he won't listen. Says we can't afford repairs right now with the farm struggling. I'm scared, not just for myself, but for the kids. What if something happens when one of them is driving? I can't bear the thought. I've decided to take it to the mechanic myself next week, no matter what William says. I just pray nothing happens before then. Lisa's voice trailed off, the weight of Margaret's words hanging heavy in the air. Ethan and Grace sat stunned, their minds reeling with the implications. She knew, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. She knew about the brakes. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her. "Oh God, Mom," Lisa continued, her voice shaking. "There's more." On the last page, she turned to the final entry, dated the day of the accident. "I couldn't wait any longer. I'm taking the car in today no matter what William says. I overheard Grace saying she was going to borrow it tonight to drive into town. I can't risk it. I'll drive it to the mechanic myself even if I have to walk back. My children's safety is worth more than any argument with William. I just hope I'm not too late." The kitchen fell silent as the full weight of the revelation sank in. Their mother had known. She had tried to prevent the very tragedy that tore their family apart. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the kitchen, his hands clenched at his sides. "Dad knew," he said, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. "He knew about the breaks and he did nothing. And then he let us believe. He let me blame Grace all these years." Grace sat frozen, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process this new information. Their mother's last act had been an attempt to protect them, to prevent the very accident that claimed her life. Lisa watched the siblings with concern, realizing the magnitude of what she had just revealed. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I should have told you sooner, but I was trying to honor Margaret's wishes. And then, after the accident, it just seemed like it would cause more pain." Ethan turned to his wife, his expression softening slightly. "It's not your fault, Lisa. You were just doing what Mom asked." He moved back to the table, sitting heavily in his chair. "What do we do with this?" he asked, looking between Grace and Lisa. How do we reconcile this with everything we thought we knew about Dad?" Grace reached out, taking her brother's hand. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we face it together, just like everything else." As the three of them sat there, the revelations of the past week swirling around them, they realized that the journey they had embarked upon was far from over. The truth about their mother's final day had brought both closure and new questions, forcing them to reevaluate not just their relationship with each other, but with the memory of both their parents. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the changing leaves, as if nature itself was acknowledging the seismic shift occurring within the walls of the Carter farmhouse. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with emotional landmines and painful truths yet to be uncovered. But as Ethan and Grace looked at each other across the kitchen table, their hands clasped tightly, one thing was clear. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it as a family, broken, healing, but united at last. The days following Lisa's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan and Grace. The siblings found themselves grappling with a complex mix of grief, anger, and a desperate need for understanding. The image of their father, once a pillar of strength and integrity, was now tarnished by the knowledge of his role in their mother's death and the years of misplaced blame that followed. On a particularly crisp autumn morning, Ethan and Grace sat on the farmhouse porch, steaming mugs of coffee warming their hands. The sprawling fields before them, once a source of pride and contentment, now seemed to mock them with their serenity. "I've been thinking," Grace began hesitantly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, "about Dad, about Mom, about everything." Ethan turned to her, his eyes encouraging her to continue. "I'm angry," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "So angry at Dad for what he did, for letting us believe a lie for all these years." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I'm also grateful in a way. If it weren't for his last request, for this year he's given us, we might never have discovered the truth. We might never have found our way back to each other." Ethan nodded slowly, his own emotions evident in the tightness of his jaw. "I know what you mean. I've been struggling with the same thing. How do we reconcile the father we knew with the man who made these choices?" Grace sipped her coffee, her gaze distant. "Maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can acknowledge that he was flawed, that he made terrible mistakes, but also remember the good parts. The father who taught us to ride bikes, who stayed up all night when we were sick, who loved us in his own way. And Mom," Ethan added softly, "her last act was trying to protect us. She died a hero in a way. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Ethan who finally spoke again, his voice hesitant but determined. "Grace, I think it's time we reached out to Sarah." Grace's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "You're right. After everything we've learned, everything we've been through, I think we owe it to ourselves and to Dad's memory to at least try." With trembling hands, Grace retrieved the locket containing Sarah's contact information. As Ethan dialed the number on speakerphone, the siblings exchanged a nervous glance. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as they thought it might go to voicemail, a soft, hesitant voice answered. "Hello." Grace squeezed Ethan's hand as he spoke. "Hi, is this Sarah?" "Sarah Thompson." "Yes, this is she." "Who's calling?" Ethan took a deep breath. "My name is Ethan Carter. I'm your brother, and I'm here with our sister, Grace." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a moment, Ethan and Grace feared they had made a terrible mistake. But then, "Oh my God!" Sarah's voice came through, choked with emotion. I've been hoping you'd call. Ever since Mom, Amelia, told me about you both before she died. I didn't know how to reach out." The conversation that followed was tentative at first, but gradually warmed as the siblings shared snippets of their lives, of their parents, of the complex emotions surrounding their newly discovered connection. Sarah, it turned out, had struggled with her own feelings about William Carter and the secret of her parentage. As the call drew to a close, Sarah's voice grew serious. "Listen, I know this is a lot to process, for all of us, but would you be open to meeting in person?" Ethan and Grace exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Grace nodded, and Ethan smiled as he turned back to the phone. "We'd love that, Sarah. Why don't you come to the farm? There's a lot we need to talk about, a lot of family history to share." As they hung up, a mix of excitement and apprehension filled the air. The prospect of meeting their half-sister, of expanding their family in ways they never imagined, was both thrilling and terrifying. "What do we do now?" Grace asked, her voice small but hopeful. Ethan stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Now we prepare. We've got a lot of work to do if we're going to honor Dad's wishes for the farm. And I think I have an idea about that." Over the next few days, Ethan and Grace threw themselves into their work with renewed purpose. They pored over the farm's financial records, consulted with agricultural experts, and began to form a plan that would not only save their family legacy but transform it into something new and meaningful. The night before Sarah was due to arrive, the siblings sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers between them. Lisa sat with them, offering support and insight as they finalized their proposal. "Are you sure about this?" Lisa asked, looking between Ethan and Grace. "It's a big step." Grace nodded, a determined glint in her eye. "It feels right. After everything we've learned, everything we've been through, this is how we move forward. How we honor Mom and Dad's memory and build something for the future." Ethan reached across the table, taking Grace's hand in his. "Together," he said simply. As the sun set on the Carter farm, casting long shadows across the fields that had been in their family for generations, Ethan and Grace stood united. The pain of the past would always be a part of them, but it no longer defined them. They had found their way back to each other, uncovered painful truths, and were now poised to forge a new path, one that included a sister they never knew they had. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emotions to navigate. But for the first time in years, the Carter siblings faced the future not with dread or resentment, but with hope. They had weathered the storm of their father's last request, emerging stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. As night fell on the eve of Sarah's arrival, the old farmhouse seemed to settle around them, creaking and sighing as if in approval of the healing that had taken place within its walls. And in the quiet darkness, Ethan and Grace allowed themselves to feel, at last, the peace that comes with forgiveness of each other, of their parents, and most importantly, of themselves. The morning dawned crisp and clear, a perfect Virginia autumn day. Ethan and Grace moved about the farmhouse with nervous energy, straightening cushions and rearranging flowers for what felt like the 100th time. The imminent arrival of Sarah, their newly discovered half-sister, had filled them both with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Do you think she'll like us?" Grace asked, smoothing down her dress for the umpteenth time. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "She'd be crazy not to. Besides, we're family. That counts for something, right?" As if on cue, the sound of tires on gravel announced Sarah's arrival. The siblings exchanged one last look before heading out to the porch. A woman stepped out of the car, her resemblance to their father unmistakable. Sarah Thompson had William Carter's eyes and jawline, but there was a softness to her features that reminded them of the photo of Amelia they'd seen in the locket. For a moment, the three stood in awkward silence, the weight of their shared history and unknown future hanging between them. Then, almost simultaneously, they moved toward each other. The hug that followed was tentative at first, but soon turned warm and genuine. As they pulled apart, all three were wiping away tears. "I can't believe you're really here," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long, ever since Mom told me about you both before she passed." They made their way inside, settling in the living room with cups of coffee. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily as they shared stories of their childhoods, their parents, and the shocking revelations of the past few weeks. "I wish I'd known him," Sarah said softly, looking at a photo of William on the mantel. "Mom always spoke of him with such love, even after all those years." Ethan and Grace exchanged a glance, silently deciding how much to share about their complicated feelings toward their father. In the end, they opted for honesty, telling Sarah about William's role in their mother's accident and the years of misplaced blame that followed. Sarah listened with wide eyes, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "Oh God, I had no idea. I'm so sorry you both went through that." As the day wore on, the initial awkwardness faded, replaced by a growing sense of connection. They discovered shared interests, similar mannerisms, and a common desire to understand their complex family history. As evening approached, Ethan cleared his throat. "Sarah, there's something Grace and I want to discuss with you." Grace nodded, pulling out the folder they'd prepared. "We've been thinking a lot about Dad's last wish, about the farm and our family legacy. And we've come to a decision." Sarah leaned forward, curiosity evident in her expression. "We want to turn the farm into a retreat center," Ethan explained. "A place for families to heal, to reconnect. We'll still keep some of the agricultural aspects, but we want to use this land to help others who've been through what we have. Estrangement, loss, complicated family dynamics." Grace continued, her eyes shining with excitement. "We'll offer counseling services, workshops on forgiveness and communication, and just a peaceful place for people to come together and work through their issues." That's amazing," Sarah breathed. "What a beautiful way to honor your parents' memory." Ethan and Grace exchanged a smile before turning back to Sarah. "We'd like you to be a part of it," Ethan said. "If you want to, of course. We know you have your own life, but—" "Yes," Sarah interrupted, her face lighting up. "Yes, absolutely. I'd be honored to be involved." The rest of the evening was spent discussing plans for the retreat center, sharing more family stories, and getting to know each other better. As night fell, the three found themselves on the porch, looking out over the moonlit fields. "You know," Sarah said softly, "I always felt like something was missing in my life. Even when I didn't know about you both, there was this emptiness. But being here, with you, it feels like coming home." Grace reached out, taking Sarah's hand in hers. "We feel the same way. It's like a piece of the puzzle we didn't even know was missing has finally fallen into place." Ethan nodded, wrapping an arm around each of his sisters. "Dad's last wish was for us to heal, to come together as a family. I think he'd be proud of what we've accomplished." As they stood there, the three siblings united under the starry Virginia sky, they felt the presence of those who had gone before them: William, Margaret, Amelia. The complex tapestry of love, loss, and redemption that had brought them to this moment. The journey ahead would not be without its challenges. There were still wounds to heal, truths to reconcile, and a new family dynamic to navigate. But as they looked out over the land that had been in their family for generations, land that would now serve as a beacon of hope for others, they knew they were on the right path. The Carter family farm, once a source of division and pain, would now become a place of healing and new beginnings. And Ethan, Grace, and Sarah, brought together by an unexpected twist of fate, would face the future not as strangers linked by a secret past, but as siblings united by love, forgiveness, and a shared vision for the future. As they headed back inside, arm in arm, the old farmhouse seemed to welcome them, its creaks and settles a comforting reminder of the generations that had come before. And in the quiet of the night, as three hearts beat in newfound harmony, the spirits of William and Margaret Carter could finally rest easy, knowing that their children had found their way back to each other and to themselves. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.